and thank you for joining us today, and welcome to this session, The Impacts of COVID-19 on the Demographic Components of Change. I'm your chair for this session. My name is Tanuja Doss, and I'm from Treasury's Centre for Population. Thanks very much to Edith Gray, for letting me use her office to chair this session. I'm joined today by Professor Peter McDonald, Jennifer Lang, Dr. Elin Charles-Edwards, and Professor James Raymer. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands from which we're all meeting today, all different lands, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. So before we start the session, just a little bit of housekeeping, which I think many of you will know from past sessions. We've got four talks or four presentations today, which will each run for about 15 minutes. So we'll hear each of those and then we'll open up for questions at the end. As with earlier sessions, we're managing the webinar behind the scenes, so everybody's muted by default, and you can ask questions by raising your virtual hand, or you can write your questions in the chat, and I'll read it out for you. I'd like to thank all of our presenters for agreeing to participate in this, in what I hope is a really interesting session, looking at the impacts of COVID-19 on demographic components of change. So we might get started because I'm sure there's a lot of material to cover. We'll start with Professor Peter McDonald, who'll talk about our first component of change, fertility. Peter McDonald is Professor of Demography in the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health, University of Melbourne, and his presentation today is based on a report available from the Centre for Population website on Australia's future fertility. I'll now hand over to Peter.
Hello, let me just thanks Tanuja for that introduction, and I'll acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the custodians of the land where I'm now sitting. Now I'll share screen so we can, here we go. And okay, now this talk is about the impact of COVID-19 on Australian fertility rates, but it's really set in much more against the longer term trend in Australian fertility, which in the longer run is I think, more important than the shorter term impact of COVID. So that's what's been happening to the Australian total fertility rate over a period of time. This is all based on year of occurrence data. And there was this very long period of decline during the 1990s into the 2000s in the Australian fertility rate, led to policy changes. And in 2004, the Howard government introduced several policies. And then we had a bit of a boom. The boom was not just due to policy, but I think policy had its impact. But it was also due to the fact we had an economic boom at the same time, but also to the fact that a lot of what was going on in the 1990s was delay of births and delay of the first births. A lot of the births that had been delayed took place in this period. So we rose up to quite a high level, around about 2, but since then it's been shooting downwards. And in recent years, it's been plunging downwards. And the most recent published figure was 1.66, which is by far the lowest figure in Australian history. And this is a trend which goes right across Australia, as you can see from these state figures. Every state and territory has a decline going on over these few years. And I pointed out the state of Victoria there, and Victoria historically does tend to lead trends in Australia in fertility, and it's down to 1.56, which is getting down towards really problematic levels, I think. By age, you can see this. Here I've got the younger ages from 15 to 30 and what's been happening, and divided into 3 periods. This is the kind of boom period in the middle, but then the plunge period, you see that pretty much every age under 30, well, at every age under 30, there's been a decline in fertility. So part of what's been going on recently is further delay. But it's quite strong actually in the older ages of this range, that is 25 to 30, have been coming down quite strongly. So that, but it's also at the younger ages as well. Now, these are what we call the recuperation ages 31 to 40, the ages at which we make up for the previous delay. And you can see rises in fertility reflecting increasing recuperation of previous delays. But again, in the last period, that's flattened off pretty much. There's not much further going on. But this flattening off is partly due to the boom years. These are the people who went through the boom years, had their births at that time, and then since then have they've already had the births that they were going to have. Now this is what we call tempo effects, the whole period from 1990 onwards, subject to changes in the timing of births, especially first births. When timing changes, it's primarily about first births. And tempo effects can have a substantial impact on the annual total fertility rate and making it very difficult to interpret period trends or annual trends in fertility. And as I've just described, tempo effects consists of postponement of births at younger ages while making up for some births, but not necessarily all of these births, at older ages. Now, if you can, the alternative way of looking at fertility is to analyse it by birth cohorts, women who are all born in the same year. And the trends are much, much smoother and easier to interpret if you do that. Now here's this is birth cohort data just showing you the delay in fertility that's been going on. This is the age by which the accumulated fertility of a cohort reaches 1.0. So it's a measure of early childbearing. And so you can see that right throughout this long period, it's been rising. It was flattened though during the boom period, but it's recommenced. The delay has recommenced since then. Of course, if you go back earlier than the first year here, 1966-67, it was rising substantially as well. And so we've been delaying the first birth in Australia for almost 50 years, 40 years. It gets increasingly older. Can't go on forever. Now, here's a way of looking at fertility, which is maybe complex, but what it does here is we take the accumulated fertility by age as we go through age of the 1966-67 birth cohort as a standard. We set that equal to 0. And then we look at each subsequent cohort and see how far it falls below the 1966-67 birth cohort at the given age. And so you can see that with each successive cohort, you get this continual falling off. That's the delay. But then you get this recuperation occurring afterwards, and they're catching up to where they'd been previously. The ages that you have here, delay goes to about age 31 now, recuperation between 31 and 41, that 10-year period, and 41 to 50 is pretty flat and pretty small. So it's not terribly important. Now you can do some indices, and that's what I did in the study for the Treasury. You can take as an index of delay the accumulated fertility of a cohort to age 31 compared to an original cohort, the 66-67 one in this case. That shows you the extent of delay that's going on. But then an index of recuperation is for the same cohort, looking at how much it increases between age 31 and age 41. I've used that measure, and here it is here over time, the delay index, which is this one here, which continually goes down. The blue part of the chart is actual data, and the orange part is projected. So in the projections that I do is that's the only little bit of projection that I do for those ages. The other part is the recuperation index, which goes up. As one goes down, the other one goes up. It flattens out towards the middle period, which is the boom years, but is started up again a bit later on. Okay, well, what is the additional impact of COVID? That's the trend pre-COVID. What happens with COVID? Now, the usual story is that fertility is affected by economic uncertainty, and we've had a period of economic uncertainty. Fortunately, coming to somewhat of an end, hopefully, in the near future. But this is what happened in previous periods of economic uncertainty to the total fertility rate. These are the absolute falls in total fertility rate from one year to the next. And so you'll see that the fall from between 1930 and 1931 was 0.23. That was a big number. Down here between 1972 and 1973, it was 0.24. So they're the biggest we've had in the past in economic recession periods. In recent recessions, however, the 1980s recession, the 1990s recession, and the global financial crisis, the impacts were actually pretty small. But the COVID impact we expect is a pretty large impact. And so it's impossible really to say exactly how much it's going to be, but the best guess was somewhere between the 1930s recession and zero. But there's another interesting study recently published which looked at Google keywords relating to contraception conception and pregnancy, and it was related to the USA. And they found that they modelled past fertility on the basis of this measure, and then modelled future fertility or near future, November 2020 to February 2021. And they predicted a drop of about 15% in births in the United States on the basis of fewer searches for conception and pregnancy words. And that would be, that 15% is equivalent to about 0.25 births per woman when applied to the Australian total fertility rate. So it's up towards the maximum that we saw in the 1930s and 1970s recessions. But it was differential, and the blacks and, for example, and those without college education more generally, were predicted to have larger declines because COVID would have a bigger impact on them. And now it's interesting to think about what we could do in Australia, and I wonder whether Medicare statistics might be, the Centre for Population could run off and talk to Medicare and get statistics on first antenatal visits, which are really up to date, and that might be a kind of indicator of where we're going. Okay, so I did two COVID scenarios, one called the likely scenario, where TFRs assumed to fall just due to COVID by 0.15 babies per woman in 2021. And that around 80% of the babies that are deferred because of COVID are assumed to be recuperated by 2032. So 20% of the births that are set aside because of COVID never happen, is the assumption. In the severe COVID scenario, a different one, we've set it up near that maximum number, the 0.25, and if it's a higher number, it goes on longer, etc., then 30% of the births are assumed never to happen. The deferral of births due to COVID is assumed to take place between the ages of 21 and 40, where it's kind of standard decisions are made. Because at younger ages and at older ages, they're kind of non-standard decision making at those ages. So it's principally in that age range. And based on the age distributions of first and second births, and this having a bigger impact on first births, 2/3 of the fall in total fertility is assumed to occur in the 20s, and 1/3 in the 30s. And then going out further, the COVID effect is assumed to apply to gradually reduce, well, not gradually, fairly rapidly reduce over the following years between 2022 and 2025. So rather than a 1.15 effect, it gets smaller across time. So it's a scenario. I made it up myself, but it's based on some logic, I think. And that's the final slide, which shows you the impacts on the projection. So the line that runs across the middle is the projection of Australian total fertility in the absence of COVID and running through, falling, but falling relatively slowly. And I think that's the key thing about this exercise is, I've kind of slowed down the precipitous decline that we saw before that's already happened. But I still have it continuing to fall, but not, heading down to extremely low levels. And then there's the two COVID effects, what they look like under the assumptions that I gave you before. So I think that's the end of it. Yes, it is. Thanks very much, Tanuja. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much for that, Peter. So we'll go to our second component of demographic change, which is mortality. And this presentation will be from Jennifer Lang, who is convener of the Actuaries Institute's working group on COVID-19 and who this year was awarded the Actuary of the Year by the Actuaries Institute. Her presentation is based on a report available from the Institute's website. I'll now hand over to her. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for having me, everyone. So this picture is a picture from the Quarantine Station Cemetery from 1918 in Manly. So I do like taking pictures to illustrate my slides, and what I'm talking about is COVID-19 impacts on mortality. And we've been looking at the ABS reports for mortality, which have been released on a monthly basis this year for the first time. Sorry, I just need to work out how to move my slide on. There we go. So I'm going to start just by giving you a little bit of information about the worldwide mortality rates, because I think that's an important view of how things are working here in Australia. Then an update on mortality itself from COVID-19, which we're very fortunate in Australia has been actually much less than most of the rest of the world. And then probably more interesting to the audience is the indirect impacts on mortality, what's been happening because the COVID-19 lockdowns and the economic impacts. And then a little bit about how comorbidity has been impacting COVID-19. So first of all, total deaths worldwide. So you'll probably recall that the first peak of deaths worldwide from COVID-19 were back in April, where especially the EU, the UK and Northeastern America had huge impacts which were overwhelming hospitals. And these, I think the maximum was nearly 7,000 a day. And then the effective lockdowns reduced the impacts so that as we went through the rest of the year, different parts of the world took over in terms of where the impacts were. So particularly Latin America, Brazil, Mexico, and India started to have impacts. And then as the mixing across the world happened again, we had bigger impacts again from Europe and the US. So we're now back at an even higher rate of death across the world than we did in April. Not higher yet in the US, but we're getting close. So I guess the other key point to make about mortality is, and anybody who is familiar with pandemics, epidemics would recognize this, that it's very hard to count all deaths. So in different countries are counting deaths in different ways. So in some countries you need a positive COVID test. In other countries, suspicion of COVID is enough. Depends on what's on the birth certificate. So these deaths that you can see on this graph are definitely understated, probably by at least 50%, possibly more, particularly in some of the countries with worse statistical analysis. So remember that when we start looking at Australia. The other key point to make, and you'd all be familiar with this, is that coronavirus case fatality rates by age are very skewed to older ages. So what I've got on this graph shows you the measured case fatality rates in South Korea, Spain, China, and Italy, which were hardest hit at the beginning. Now, a case fatality rate depends on both getting the right number of cases and getting the right number of deaths. And I talked before about how the number of deaths is probably not understated. The number of cases is also probably understated. So particularly in Spain and Italy, they weren't counting all of the individual cases. So the actual cases in Spain and Italy were lower. So the death rates look higher than they really are. But from everything that we've analysed across the world and other people have analysed, the best estimate that we found is that the case fatality rate for coronavirus is about the same as your age-specific mortality rate for the next year. So if everyone in the country came down with COVID-19, then we'd effectively double the death rate for the year. So that gives you a sense of what the death rates are. But clearly, the older you are, the more dangerous a disease it is. So just a reminder about what's happened in actual cases in Australia since the first case. We've had two peaks. The first peak was across the country and largely came from overseas cases, but spreading. And then we had a very severe lockdown, which reduced the cases here. And then, as you'd all be familiar with, the second wave in Victoria. Almost all of these cases that you can see on the graph of Victoria, and as the cases came down, we're back to almost all of the cases being from hotel quarantine. So today in Australia, we only had one case that wasn't from hotel quarantine, and that was from the small outbreak in South Australia. So we will see that pattern in the deaths. But the interesting thing, and remember what I said earlier about measurement of mortalities, I suspect that first wave had more deaths even in Australia than we measured. So this is the daily view of deaths as they were reported from COVID-19. This spike here in Victoria is actually not all in those days. It was deaths that were gathered up that had happened over the previous month. So effectively we had a small first wave of deaths, which was across the country. Probably the worst hit was New South Wales, was an aged care outbreak there. And then a much bigger wave, which was again, mostly aged care facilities, but not entirely. And that was almost all in Victoria. I think there was one death in New South Wales in that second wave. So that's the deaths that we've seen for COVID-19, but actually the bigger impact on mortality in Australia is from indirect mortality. So this is a very busy graph, but what we've put together is a view of the average mortality week by week for the last 5 years. So 2015 to 2019 is the range of this graph. And then the direct blue line is what we expect to happen, which is based on a combination of what the average was in the previous years, but then the fact that mortality gradually improves. We've scaled all of these actual deaths by the total population. So the total population is increasing. So we've scaled the deaths to increase the population, and also the fact that we have a gradually aging population. So we've scaled it for the age impacts as well. So what you can see is that at the beginning of this year, the deaths, which are the orange dots, were basically following the line of what we would expect, some up, some down. Here in March, that first wave, we had quite a big spike in deaths, and that's behind our view that there were probably there were more deaths than were likely reported in those couple of weeks. That extra is about 100, and there were, I think the biggest number of deaths in any week was well less than 100. And then the next thing that happens is normally in Australia, we have a peak of deaths during winter, and that's largely respiratory deaths, but also dementia deaths and other diseases of old age, which are worsened by respiratory issues. But this year, we have not had that. We've effectively had almost the same level of deaths as we had been having in summer. So that's actually been a really good news story for mortality in Australia, except as we got to the second wave. The ABS has been releasing information on a monthly basis. They did release August yesterday, but we haven't analysed it yet, so this only goes up to July. And you can see that in that final week in July, when the Victorian wave really started hitting, we had a big increase in deaths in that week. Now, interestingly, that shaded dot is the deaths without COVID-19, and this is with the deaths that are identified as COVID-19. And our suspicion is that at least some of that is undiagnosed COVID-19, but it also could be pressure on the aged care system. So we've looked at individual causes as well, just to give a view of this. And you can see particularly respiratory disease normally has a big peak in winter, and it's been absolutely without a peak this year. So COVID-19 isn't counted in respiratory disease. And in New South Wales, I think there hasn't been a flu death since April, and normally there are a reasonable number of flu deaths by this stage in the winter. Dementia is an interesting one. These are the deaths that are identified as being caused by dementia on the death certificate. And you can see that that also normally goes up during winter, potentially because respiratory diseases are more likely to exacerbate the health of someone with dementia. And so that's also had a lower level of death until we get to that last week in July when the Victorian deaths hit. The good news story, there's been a lot of discussion about the impact of lockdowns on mental health, and there has certainly been some evidence in presentations to hospitals of worsening mental health, but I was pleased to see that there hasn't been any change in suicide death rates in the 2 states that we've seen information for, which are Victoria and New South Wales, where effectively the suicide rates have been the same as previous years. And finally, I just wanted to show you a little bit about comorbidities. There's a lot of discussion about the impact of comorbidities on the death rates from COVID-19. And a lot of reporting shows, people talk about the fact that people who die from COVID-19 do tend to have comorbidities, but as we saw earlier, the fact that people who are older are also more likely to die, you can't really tell whether that's the age or the comorbidity. So this table here shows the Australian Bureau of Statistics proportion of deaths which have a comorbidity, and you can see that dementia in particular and chronic heart disease also tend to have more deaths from COVID-19. But in the UK, there's been a really good analysis using NHS data, and sadly they've had a lot more deaths from COVID-19 in the UK, so they can do a serious statistical analysis. What they've found is that once you correct for age and other comorbidities, not all of these conditions actually lead to higher death rates from COVID-19. In fact, hypertension, high blood pressure, it seems to have a slight protective effect, so you're less likely to die from COVID-19 if you have hypertension. But dementia in particular is a particularly poor comorbidity. Again, hard to tell whether that's issues from lack of care or actually the comorbidity itself. And diabetes, particularly uncontrolled diabetes, is actually a very risky comorbidity to have. So I've found that quite interesting in understanding who should be most concerned about isolating with COVID-19. So that's all I had in this presentation. So I'm happy to hand back. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Jennifer. So I'm going to turn now to Dr. Elin Charles-Edwards to talk about net internal migration. Elin is the Deputy Director of the Queensland Centre for Population Research at the University of Queensland. I'll now hand over to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanuja. All right. Oh, starting at the end. Okay, hopefully everyone can see my screen. So the work I'm presenting today is actually a real team effort. It's work undertaken by the Queensland Centre for Population Research in partnership with the Centre for Population. And this work really was directed and designed to try and anticipate the impact of COVID-19 on internal migration levels and patterns in Australia. So it was pretty apparent early on that there was a significant potential for COVID-19 to impact various components of demographic change. But internal migration was flagged relatively early on as one type of, or one component that might be disproportionately impacted. Unfortunately, there's quite a significant lag of data on internal migration. So there really is a lack of contemporaneous data. The ABS have done excellent work though this year. Congratulate them on bringing some statistics out early, but we're really sort of operating a bit blind. The other issue with anticipating the impacts of COVID-19 on internal migration in Australia was there hasn't actually been a lot of statistical modelling of the drivers of internal migration. This is largely because we've had long periods of uninterrupted economic growth. We do know that internal migration, at least overseas, responds to changes in economic conditions, but we didn't have that fundamental modelling here. So this body of work, to scope the potential impact, we've utilised descriptive analysis, a number of statistical models of internal migration flows, both in and out flows, as well as aggregate flows at the national, state, and also the Greater Capital City Statistical Area scale. We also complemented this with a survey of expert opinion to gauge people's sentiments on the likely impacts of COVID-19 on internal migration flows. And towards the end, I'm going to talk about some emerging data, which provides a bit of a leading indicator of what we might expect in the coming months. All right. All right, so turning first to interstate migration, this graph simply shows interstate migration rates going back to the 1970s. Now, internal migration, actually migration more generally, is probably the most volatile component of demographic change. It fluctuates quite markedly with economic cycles. So if we actually look at the graph here, we can see you have periods of decline tied to economic recessions. So the recession of the early 1970s resulted in a 20% decline over a 3-year period in the level of interstate migration, and this was followed and compensated for by an upswing in subsequent years. The largest ever year-on-year decline that we've seen in interstate flows was 13.5%, and this was in the early 1980s, so following that recession. But again, it was followed by a strong rebound, and we actually saw the highest level of interstate migration ever observed in 1989. Now, since this time, interstate migration has actually been less volatile. So we're not seeing these sort of big year-on-year volatility in peaks and troughs. So the recession of the 1990s and the GFC, we did see some response of interstate migration to these recessions, but it wasn't as deep. We saw about an 8% year-on-year decline. We know from the US and from this sort of descriptive evidence that migration in Australia is in fact pro-cyclical with GDP, so we would expect to see some response as our economy experiences a downturn. Also should appreciate that this expected downturn is occurring within the context of a much longer term downturn in internal migration that we're seeing in many countries in the developed world, the US being one, but also some evidence for this occurring in Australia. So I've got some good sort of suggested evidence from just looking at the patterns in a descriptive fashion. We've actually done some modelling here to try and enumerate and capture the impact of shifts in GDP, unemployment, and ageing on the level of an interstate migration. And this modelling actually distinguished between long-term effects, so this is a sort of secular decline in internal migration that we're seeing, as well as these short-term effects that might lead to significant year-on-year volatility. So running this modelling, we found a significant impact of GDP per capita on interstate migration. So as GDP per capita rises, we tend to see an increase. As it declines, we expect the inverse and see a decline in interstate migration. So using these data, we actually can run a forecast of what we expect the level of interstate migration to look like, given sort of GDP forecasts by the Reserve Bank and others, and we ran this, so it's an error-corrected model forecast. And what our results suggested that if we actually saw the decline in GDP that was forecast, we could perhaps expect a 15% year-on-year decline in the level of interstate migration, and then once again a subsequent rebound. So this is sort of trying to capture the overall level. Trying to find support for that, there was some interesting data collected by the ABS and the impact of COVID-19 surveys. And this data was able to be compared with the HILDA data. So we sort of anticipated GDP would lead to a decline in internal migration, wanted to see whether that was in fact reflected by people's intentions to move. The results of the ABS survey, which was at the beginning of the year, first half of the year, suggested around a 3% decline in intentions. So this is not the mass level or a mass decline that we anticipate using our economic forecasting, but does suggest that the level will be impacted. Now, of course, this survey was quite early on. It was before the Victorian shutdown. But again, all the sort of the picture and the evidence is pointing in the same direction. Our experts agree. We surveyed around 60 academic demographers, government demographers, and tried to get their sort of take on what they thought the level of interstate migration might do over the next 12 months. And the consensus really pointed towards a decline. That was the majority response, ranging from a 5% to a 30% decline. Interestingly, while we've modelled the economic in the relationship between internal migration and sort of the economic outcome, border closures and quarantine were sort of seen to have as significant or even a bigger potential impact on interstate migration. And this has been sort of an interesting context. We're not used to having border controls on our flows. In fact, only Western Australia really didn't have an exemption. All the rest of the states did have an exemption to move for permanent migration, but there was an additional cost of quarantine. So once that was introduced, that was seen as something that was likely to dampen the overall level of interstate flows. So we can reasonably expect interstate migration to be lower over the next little while, but what about the pattern? Will all states and territories be impacted equally? We know that different states and patterns show significant volatility again in their patterns of net gains and losses. However, there are some commonalities over time. New South Wales, for example, is a sort of a net loser of internal migrants. Queensland has long been a net gainer. But states like Victoria have oscillated between net losses and gains over this longer period, as has WA, Tasmania, reflecting things like economic cycles, economic booms and busts. So again, we've done some modelling. We've modelled the ins and out migration rates, the dependent variable, looking at a range of really economic drivers. And what we found in the short-term effects was that a 10% increase in states' unemployment rates relative to other states is expected, based on past evidence, to lead to an 0.8% increase in the rate of out-migration, 0.37% decrease in the rate of in-migration. So the net effect on migration is a 1.53% decline. So this is really talking about these relative shifts, particularly in unemployment being the significant factor here. Interestingly, the international migration rate also does have an impact on the level of internal migration, but the magnitude of the effect is much, much smaller. So we can also model bilateral interstate flows. So these are origin-destination pairs using a spatial interaction framework. So this has been done using data from the period 2004 to 18. Again, we have some economic variables coming out of significance, so the unemployment rate, and also house prices, which is often postulated to be a major driver of interstate flows. And the results showed that a 10% increase in unemployment at the destination could be expected to lead to around a 1.5% decrease in inflows. And also an increase in residential property prices is shown to have a positive effect on migration flows. So the inverse is if we see widespread decline in residential property prices, this would have a further dampening effect on overall migration patterns. So a lot of the speculation on the impact of COVID-19 on internal migration hasn't been at the state level. Obviously that's been of a lot of interest, but people, particularly in the regions, have sort of seen COVID maybe as an opportunity to reverse long-standing population decline, with a view that a shift particularly towards work from home arrangements might actually increase moves away from capital cities to the regions. Looking at recent data, we have actually seen over time an increase in flows from the capital city to the rest of states, although this did stabilise between 2018 and 2019. And also we also saw an increase from rest of state to capital city. So there's these counterflows which are offsetting these. Running some modelling again, but this time looking at the different types of flows between greater capital cities. So particularly focusing on capital cities to the rest of states. So this is flows in favour of regional areas. Again, we found statistically significant relationships between unemployment rates, but also house prices. So a 10% increase in unemployment rates in capital cities relative to regional areas is expected to boost migration to the rest of state by around 4%, while 10% increase in house prices in regional areas will decrease migration. So there's a tension here between employment opportunities and house prices. So these are again the economic forces which we might anticipate to impact into GCCSA migration. But what's not being captured are some of the other sort of more difficult to quantify factors which have been posited to drive into GCCSA flows. In contrast to interstate migration, there's less consensus with respect to the direction of flows. There does tend to be sort of a view that perhaps the level of flows between capital cities and regional areas will be stable or maybe increase, with a slight shift in direction in favour of regional areas. And when we look at what the drivers of this might be, flexible working arrangements is seen as a key driver, leading to a slight increase as regional areas become more attractive, but there's sort of less consensus with the other factors that we identified. So a bit of a mixed picture. All right, so this is sort of our modelling. It focused on the economic drivers of migration, but doesn't really give us an excellent handle of what's happening on the ground. Now, we've been really lucky that the ABS have produced their provisional regional interstate migration estimates, and I thank the ABS for all their work. So we've actually been able to get a bit of a window on what's been going on, particularly in the first half of 2020. And if we look at the total level of interstate moves, we have in fact seen a decline. There's a 15% year-on-year decline in the volume of interstate migration, comparing Q2 2019 to Q2 2020. So it's nice when your modelling points to a result that we actually observe in the data. So we are seeing that overall decline. If we look at the patterns of interstate flows, what we're seeing is an increase in departures in terms of total share from Victoria relative to other states. So this has sort of really picked up, but interestingly, it sort of seemed to be occurring slightly before we hit these major COVID lockdowns. And similarly, there's been a decline in arrivals to Victoria, but again, this was occurring prior to COVID. So we are seeing a shift in interstate trends over time. If we look at the prime data for GCCSAs, we can see that in the Q2 2020, we've actually experienced a pretty major loss away from capital cities, which is the largest negative outflows from capital cities we've observed going back to 2001 of around 10,000. So there does seem to be some shift both in the level but in the patterns. Now, one of the probably interesting things working as a demographer in internal migration at the moment is the range of opinions that are out there in the popular press, but also the range of data sets that have been alluded to. So real estate search sites, also companies such as Movil have been putting out signals, data that shows the signal, so search data of what internal migration trends might be doing over the next little while. And I fortunately have entered a partnership with Movil. So this is a website where it's a sort of a removalist aggregation site. It asks people, well, people enter where they live, where they're moving to, and it gives them a whole set of removalists that they can employ to use those surveys. So these are some Movil data. These are more contemporary than the prime data produced by the ABS. And interestingly, we have sort of data up until October. And we're starting to see some really interesting trends. So this graph here is showing the share of total inquiries on the Movil site. So these origin destination inquiries and where they're actually coming from. What we're seeing from Victoria in particular is a massive spike. So departures from Victoria now is accounting for around 40%, 50% of all moves that are being people searching for removalists for. And we're seeing gains, potential arrivals in Queensland. So we're really starting to see the shift in patterns suggested by these data in this most recent quarter. And we're still awaiting official statistics, but it's very, very sort of suggestive that we might actually see some major shifts in the next couple of months. All right, so just a couple of final remarks. So we haven't had good modelling. We've done lots of modelling. We can now see the economic drivers of internal migration. What we have less of a handle are the impacts of border closures and lockdowns, and whether these are having a psychological impact to sort of trigger internal moves. We do see a decrease in interstate flows, and there's a potential for a shift in favour of regional Australia, but we're still awaiting more evidence. But contemporaneous data, and I think as demographers we need to draw on these more, does seem to suggest that something is afoot. And I guess we await the next release of ABS statistics to confirm some of these signals. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ellen. I'll just put in a plug for the regional internal migration estimates, the provisional ones. So there will be another release in February, and that's something that Centre for Population has funded the ABS to do. So yeah, looking forward to seeing what's in that and how that lines up with what we're modelling. So we'll move to our fourth component of change, which is net overseas migration. Just before we do that, I just want to remind people, if you have questions for any of the participants, please feel free to put them in the chat or to raise your virtual hand. I'm not seeing any questions in the questions box so far, so I just wanted to put that prompt. So we'll move now to our fourth session, the fourth component of change, net overseas migration, which will be led by Professor James Raymer, who's Director of the Australian Demographic and Social Research Institute at the Australian National University. Thanks very much, James.
Thank you, Tanuja. I'm not the director, just an ordinary professor these days.
Oh, my apologies.
But used to be many years ago. Okay. No, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to contribute to this session. I've really enjoyed the presentation so far, and I hope my presentation will stand up. Let me see if okay. Are we good? Okay, so I'm going to talk about international migration, and I want to do, similar to the other presentations, talk about two things. I want to talk about, well, I want to take a long-term perspective of international migration in Australia and how it's really contributed to population change. I'd like to talk about what we were thinking migration would look like before the COVID-19 pandemic. And then I'll provide some hypotheses, theories for where we might be heading after COVID-19. Okay. So, not sure, I've got a couple screens going here, but okay, so if we look at, so I did a study recently that I completed last year that gathered a bunch of demographic data in Australia to study how migrations contributed to population change over a 35-year period from 1981, which is soon after the end of the White Australia policy, up until 2000, the most recent census, 2016. And so these numbers are kind of aggregated across this 35-year period, but that shows the contributions of migration. So let me walk you through this. So between 1981 and 2016, Australia grew by 9.3 million persons. We stand at around 25 million today. Almost half, 48% of this growth was attributed to net international migration. Okay, the overseas-born population, which is around 29% of the total population, grew by 3.8 million. It doubled in size. And this population contributed, not only did the population itself grew, but they also contributed 2.5 million births to the Australian-born population. All cities in our study, we looked at 47 cities and regional areas across Australia. All of the cities and regional areas were affected affected by international migration through increased levels over time and diversity in migration streams. Also, I think it's important to realize that migrants don't just stay put, they also make subsequent movements. So over this 35-year period, 2 million immigrants redistributed amongst the major cities and regions in Australia. So this is the picture at the national level. If we just take one city that was greatly affected, just compare those numbers with Sydney, same idea as before. Sydney grew by 1.75 million persons. 74% of its growth was attributed to net international migration. The overseas-born population grew by 1.12 million. It also basically doubled in size and contributed 792,000 births, or about 65% of all the births happening in Sydney over the 35-year period. And as Elin showed in the previous ones, they also, Sydney acts as kind of a redistributor, so migrants come into Sydney and then they go elsewhere in Australia. So Sydney sent 418,000 immigrants elsewhere in Australia, They also they got a counterflow of about 254,000. So you can see that, you know, for migration, international migration, it's clearly important for the capital cities such as Sydney. Okay, now I want to walk you through just some background slides of the flows and show you how they changed. So this is a really complicated figure that I like, but it shows the numbers of immigrants coming into Australia as a country by different immigrant groups defined by birthplace. Okay, and the first thing I want you to show is there's 19 different lines, which represent the 19 different populations. First thing I want you to notice is on the left-hand side of the screen, it's relatively sparse, so there are few groups contributing to immigration. Whereas when we get to the right side of the graph, more recent years, you see there's it's a lot noisier, a lot more mess, a lot more diverse in terms of immigration streams. Okay, I'll just show you a couple patterns of these flows. So here's the UK. UK is always, has been an important stream of migration into Australia. And you can see that over time, this flow has remained one of the most important flows to Australia. A person's born in the UK. It's gone, it went down and then up and kind of stagnated for a while, increased in the 2000s and has recently declined. Another important stream that's often neglected in the immigration discussions is actually returning Australians. So these are persons born in Australia, coming back to Australia. And you can see that this flow has been pretty steady. It's been increasing as the population's gotten bigger. And so that's that pattern. New Zealand also, you know, being the neighbor, no restrictions on migration between Australia and New Zealand. This pattern has fluctuated up and down over time. Recently, it's come down from a peak in 2010. It's dropped considerably, more than half in the most recent years in our study. And then we have some of our newer immigrant groups coming predominantly from Asia. So here's Indians. You can see people born in India, very low for most of the study, but around the 2000s, really skyrocketed, jumped up, peaked in about 2008 or 9, sudden drop, and then started to climb again. The other key group is China, and here you've seen kind of a steady increase since the early 2000s. All right, because that gives you a sense of kind of the variety, the differences in immigration flows. You can't always think of immigration as one group. They're actually composed of lots of different groups with different motives, and the patterns will differ depending on where they come from. Now I just want to show you some of the kind of the subnational patterns. So we kind of divide Australia into 2 groups, or 5 big cities: Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth. These I've aggregated, still over the 35-year period, but I've aggregated the numbers across, summed them up over 5 years. And you can see that it's just gone up. In the early 1980s, Sydney received 200,000 immigrants. By the most recent period, 2011 to 2016, is up to 700,000 over a 5-year period. And you can see there's big jumps, especially after year 2000. So it's really gone up in the past 15 years. Adelaide, not so much. Now, we looked at all the, I said 47 areas. If you look at the scale, so here the scale is 700, 800,000. If we go to all the other areas, it's much kind of smaller scale. So we're talking 40 to 45,000, not hundreds of thousands. But similar types of patterns. Doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter so much what these areas are. I can show you. Here's some of the other capital cities: Hobart, Darwin, and Canberra. But again, even though the scale is much lower, they have increased their levels. And sorry, what's shaded in each bar is where they come from, the different groups. And it's probably hard to spot, but they've also, it's just showing they've become more diverse. Okay, I've got a couple of bursts on immigrant fertility, just to show that with increases in immigration, you get more immigrant births. So this is looking at a different kind of more, summed up some of the groups. But here are European these are the births contributed by persons born in the UK or other Europe. And as those populations have gotten older, smaller, so have their contributions of births. Whereas if we look at some of the newer groups like China, those persons born in China and India, we've seen their contributions to births increase. What's interesting here is the migration flow from China is higher than India, or has been, not always, but in recent years. But the births from India have been more so. So the fertility rates are different. Okay, so that's a little bit of, that's some background to look at how migration's been to Australia. That stopped in 2016. You know, I've been teaching migration for a long time, and we usually end the lecture by looking forward, where are we heading? And before COVID-19, we generally expected migration to increase, more of the same. And the reason, these are reasons I've largely drawn from this great book on migration from Ian Golden and others. Ian Golden was from the World Bank. But the reason why we expected migration to increase is, well, we're going to have a larger world population. We haven't stopped growing yet. This means more people at risk of migrating. More people migrating means more migrant networks. All things being equal, we should expect more migration. We have persistent inter-country inequality, wage disparities. We've got the increased need for specialized labor to support aging populations. That support for aging populations is increasing. We've got economic growth in the poorest countries. Economic growth leads to rural displacement, urbanization, and ultimately emigration. Rising education standards, growing working age populations in developing countries. And lastly, environmental stress. So all these things were suggesting that migration, international migration, was something that was going to stick around, wasn't going to continue. So as you can imagine, when this year happened, oh, sorry, let me go through a couple more slides. Come back. And even myself, I've done some forecasting of international migration. So I've worked with one of my long-term colleagues, Arkadiusz Wisniewski, who's at the University of Manchester. And here we modeled, these are counts of immigration to Australia. We modeled them at the age and sex-specific levels and divided by states and territories. And, you know, even in a good situation where we don't have a COVID-19, there's quite a bit of uncertainty. And I'll just show you what this graph is. So the black line is the observed data. The green kind of fuzzy data is our predictive, or as our predictions with measures of uncertainty, or predictive intervals. The blue line is observed data, but data that we didn't include in our forecast. So we did what's called an in-sample forecast to see how well our forecast would predict the observed data. And you can see we don't all, like here we did quite well. This blue line is in the New South Wales females is kind of within our predictive range, which is good. Victoria, you know, had that recent uptick that wasn't suggested by the data before then. We underpredicted and so on. And by and large, we did a pretty good job. You can see there's quite a bit of uncertainty, even when you don't have a COVID-19 situation. They don't always hit, sometimes the data were outside our predictive intervals, but just wanted to show you, this is kind of what a migration forecast would look like normally, where you use time series models and probabilistic information. We also did the same thing for immigration rates, and gives you a sense of the normal uncertainty, so-called normal uncertainty. Okay. So then 2020 happened, COVID-19, all these models, all these thinking that we've invested in forecasting populations kind of got thrown out the window, because migration, for the first time that I'm aware of, basically stopped worldwide or greatly reduced. So where does that leave us? What's going to happen now? We know right now that migration is not happening, or not happening at a large scale like it was. What will happen when this vaccine kicks in and we can return to a more normal life? What will happen to the migration flows? And here, I don't know the answer. I think we could go in lots of different directions. I'm just going to present two directions that are possibilities that I've heard discussed before. One is we'll go back to how things were, so it's a quick return. Really, COVID-19 was a blip in the trajectory of international migration to Australia, and we might even get a rebound. But basically, you know, within a couple of years, migration goes back to 2019 levels, or perhaps even higher, in line with historical trends. The other train of thought is to think of COVID-19 as a turning point and a shift in the migration patterns, not only in terms of levels, but in terms of directions. So this means migration doesn't return to levels experienced before the pandemic and may even change in character. And I want to give you some theories for why both may be plausible. So first, some theories underlying a return to pre-pandemic levels. Well, if you think about all those ideas I gave about our expectations of future migration, those pre-COVID-19 factors have not disappeared. We still have a growing population. We still have inequality. Australia is still an attractive destination, high wages with extensive migrant networks. And within Australia, it may not be possible to alter our current employment and social infrastructures in the short term. We have this kind of persistent mismatch between labor supply and labor demand. So there's a kind of recruitment aspect of migration, not only by our industries, but also by universities and other sectors that are heavily reliant on international migration and are unable to kind of change their practices, at least in the short term. So there'll be motives to go back to the way we were. There might also be a longer term concern for stagnant or declining population situations. We heard Peter talk about this kind of declining fertility. And given that migrations contributed almost half of Australia's population growth, any reduction in the migration will impact future population in Australia, assuming that we can't grow our population sufficiently through fertility. Okay, now opposite, kind of the counter arguments. So theory underlying a turning point in the migration patterns. Arguably, some patterns were in the process of shifting anyway. You saw my lines of immigration. New Zealand's gone up and down, up and down. China has been going up, but there's no reason, it probably would go down at some point in the future. And you can think of COVID-19 as kind of being a speed up process that says, okay, well, if things were starting to shift anyway, maybe COVID-19 splits it. We know speeds it up. We know China is soon going to be facing an aging problem. They're economically developing. Who knows? China is maybe a poor example, but a lot of those flows have gone up and down. And so to assume that things would continue as they were may not be a good idea. The second thing is maybe increased risk aversity as a consequence of COVID-19 on behalf of employers and universities. It's really exposed them to how vulnerable they are to pandemics. And certainly universities across Australia have been impacted greatly, have had to fire people or not encourage them to leave, I should say. Not fire, I don't know if they fired anybody, excuse me. But they've had to reduce their staffs, they've had to do some restructuring, and they can't keep doing this if it happens again, especially frequently. So we may go through a period where we don't bounce back because of the risks. Also, amongst migrants, there might be a risk adversity. And Australia is special in the sense that a lot of its migration is on the skilled program. So presumably skilled migrants might be more employable than other types of migrants. It's arguable. But at any rate, before COVID-19, migrating to another country, migrating to a country like Australia, it wasn't that risky. You could have high wages, but you could also maintain your links at home. You could go home and visit your family. If you needed to go back, you can get on a flight and be home within a day. This year has shown how isolated you can become as a migrant, and that may prevent some people from risking that, especially if they have aging parents and don't want to permanently move to another country. So there may be an increased risk aversity amongst migrants. Lastly, this year has resulted in a lot of adjustments to work practices. These adjustments, some of which may be long-term, these adjustments have resulted in less demand for immigration. So companies and universities may be more efficient, happier with a smaller staff if it could be more stable. We've learned how to work indifferently, working long distance. This may reduce the need for bringing someone into a country when you can export that work and work online. Okay, so this is my last slide. So just to summarize, I guess I'm on the belief that COVID-19 has likely changed the nature of international migration in the future. I don't think we're going to bounce back to where we were. I think something is going to change. But as you can see in Australia, the implications if we don't bounce back are huge, or potentially huge. And the reason why I put in those other stuff on fertility and so on is I think it's important to think about migrants not only as entries, but also in their subsequent demographic behaviors. And they've contributed to 2/3 of the births in Sydney. And they've also contributed to internal movements to other places in Australia from Sydney. So looking forward, how do we deal with the potentially changing migration situation? What's the risk management questions? One is how can we remain competitive in the midst of changing migration conditions? How do we meet demand for specialized or even low-skilled labor from the native population? Is it possible to improve the work-family balance, especially for women, and keep the existing and aging population trained and innovating in the systems we use? Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, for that presentation. Thank you to all of our presenters for their very interesting, very informative presentations. And also as chair, thank you for staying on time. So we'll now go to the question and answer part of this discussion. We have until 3 o'clock. So we've got around 22 minutes for question and answer. So we might try and stay to about 4 or 5 questions. I'm looking at attendees and I'm looking in the chat. If you'd like to start putting your hand up or entering any questions that you have into the chat, now's the time to do it. Perhaps all of the presentations are so good that there are no questions left. They've covered everything that people want to know or want to think about. I'll give people a moment.
Hi, Tanuja. I just have a comment on Peter's presentation. Excellent presentation, Peter. I've had a bit of a look at the Medicare pregnancy test data,
Okay.
and it's trending well below what it was in 2019. I think April pregnancy tests were a third lower, and you can get those data really easily from the Medicare site. And Victoria's, you can see the impact of the second lockdown. So yeah. It seems something's happening.
Okay, good. Not bad.
Thanks very much for that, Elin. So Elin, there is a question for you from Simone Alexander. How do regional areas cope with increased levels of migration, i.e. can their housing supply cope with increased level of migration out of cities?
Thanks, Simone. Look, it's a really interesting question, and I've been talking a lot to planners and looking at a lot of the housing data, and there are certainly really low vacancy rates in places like the Sunshine Coast. So I think there is going to be a short-term squeeze. Internal migration is part of this, but I'm also really curious about the impact of short-term moves, whether some of the housing stock's actually been shifted over to things like Airbnb as people temporarily evacuated places like Victoria to wait out lockdown. So I think there's definitely going to be pressures, and I think, the planners and the developers are rubbing their hands together with this. So yeah, look, I think there's going to be a push.
Thank you very much for that, Elin. I've got a question for all panelists. This looks like it could be quite open-ended and go for a while, so we might try and limit it to one comment each. How different would your analysis be if you were looking at New Zealand or USA? So perhaps if we start with, if we go in the order in which we had the presentations, if that's all right, if I could go to you first, Peter.
Yeah, well, I think the picture would be fairly similar. The big downturn in fertility that I showed over the last few years for Australia has occurred also in all the English-speaking countries. It's occurred in all the Nordic countries. it's a new phenomenon, and I don't think we quite understand it yet as to why it's happening. But US fertility has been dropping seriously, and I think there was a recent New Zealand figure which was very low. So we are looking at, I think, a new situation of quite low fertility in a broader range of countries than has been the case in the past.
Thank you very much for that, Peter. Jennifer, if you'd like to answer that question.
So that's very different for New Zealand and the US, as probably all of you who've been watching would appreciate. New Zealand has had a very similar pattern to Australia, with very low mortality and very lower than normal mortality this year, and they obviously have had even fewer COVID-19 deaths than us. Whereas in the US, as they haven't really had a reduction in respiratory deaths, and they've had a massive increase in COVID-19 deaths. So I think today's deaths, there were over 2,000 as they were yesterday. So very different pattern there. We're very fortunate to be here in Australia, I think.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Elin?
Look, yeah, I think we'd probably expect a decline in internal migration in both New Zealand and the US, depending on the length of the economic recession. I think the really interesting question that's going to emerge is the selection in these migration flows. I mean, there's been sort of reports out of New York, for example, where all the wealthier people are leaving during sort of peak COVID. So, you know, this might not only transform the direction of flows, but also the composition of populations. And I think that's something really to look at across the developing or developed world.
Thanks very much, Elin. And James?
Hard for me to say, but I think I still would believe that things are going to change. I mean, the US is very different from New Zealand and Australia in the sense of its migration is primarily through kind of family connections. It doesn't really have a big skill program. It does have one, but it's not very big in the scheme of things. But yeah, I don't know. That's hard. Even though I'm from America, I'm not quite sure how I haven't thought about what their future pattern would look like. I would probably say New Zealand would probably follow track with Australia. It would be similar, but I don't really know what's going to happen in Australia either. So.
Well, I've got a further question for you, James. I've got a few for you here, actually, but I might start with this one. Australia has experienced a significant shift from European migration to Asian migration. Asian economies are growing fast. Australia might become less attractive in terms of wage gaps with Asian countries. How might this affect the composition of immigration to Australia in the long term?
Well, I think that's where I was getting with my point in the shift, that a lot of the major sources of migrants to Australia, their economies are changing. They're building up education programs and other things. So this may speed things up in terms of them retaining more of their population. That's possible. But yeah, in the long run, you would expect, I mean, all these populations are aging. They're going to have their own demand for labor, similar, I think, to Australia. Whether they can compete in terms of wages, that's a question. But yeah, I think they're definitely going to, their migration patterns are going to change. More countries will become recruiters rather than senders. I mean, we'll always have a lot of migrants from India and China, not because they have high propensities to leave, but because they're so large. So that's not going to necessarily go away. But yeah, I think things are changing in Asia. And if we go back to that, the expectations, the expectation is that Asian migration will slow down or maybe even diminish. Some of the populations like South Korea and China are looking at population decline. So that would mean less migrants, all things being equal. But whereas countries in Africa are still growing pretty rapidly. So potentially that could be a major source of future migration.
Thanks very much for that, James. I've got another question for you. Suggestions on the mismatch of supply and demand in the labour market in Australia under COVID-19 and impacts of COVID-19, and particularly in sort of migrant-dominated areas such as caring.
Yeah, I haven't thought a whole lot about caring. I mean, think about agriculture. if I could start with that, and then maybe my
Yep.
idea for carrying will. But if you need migrant labor, if you can't recruit locally for your labor, and your crops are struggling already because of past droughts, I could imagine some farmers or farming industries to say, forget it, it's too hard. We can't get the labor, and there's too much uncertainty in the crops. So I could see some businesses just saying, no. With carrying, that's more difficult because that problem is only going to increase, especially amongst the aging population. So whether they will change their practices where they do more recruitment, increase wages amongst the native population, I don't think it matters a whole. For a lot of the jobs, it's still considered pretty tough work, so it's not a job that a lot of natives want to do necessarily, although a lot of natives doing it. But yeah, there may be a shift in how they recruit employees, rather than assuming that they can just get them through the immigration process. They may try to diversify their streams for labor, but those are just guesses.
Thanks very much, James. Elin, I have a follow-up question for you about infrastructure in regional areas. If it's able to keep up with population growth, if that's what we're expecting to see, could we potentially see a shift towards regional areas in the short term and then a shift back towards capital cities in the long term? And if so, what could some of those long-term implications for regional areas be?
Thanks, Tanuja. Yeah, look, I think there is a lot of uncertainty here. I think the areas that we suspect are actually gaining at the moment are high amenity areas on the peri-urban fringe. I think only certain people can actually make these sorts of movements and need flexible working arrangements. But if we have any sort of large scale shifts, we'll see it reflected in things like house prices, employment rates. And we know from our modelling exercise that shifts in those sort of variables will lead to a rebalance in the direction of migration flows. I think there is something going on. I'm really hesitant to put any real numbers on this phenomena. Because we have to wait for the next lot of ABS data, and also this interplay with temporary migration as well. We just don't know how many moves are for the long term or short term sort of COVID escapees to get out of places like Melbourne. So look, it's an excellent question, and I don't think we know the answer.
Awesome. Thanks very much for that, Elin. Any other questions or anyone? Sorry, so there is one more for you, Elin, that's just popped up. What do you see the role of regional state-sponsored migration scheme in boosting interstate migration and leading to potential regional population growth?
So the government's really tended to stay out of policies except for the Northern Territory, to incentivise interstate migration. The Northern Territory would be the one exception. It's very difficult to get people to move unless there is a clear benefit to the migrant. I know the Northern Territory pays people $5,000 if they stay there for a certain period of time, and that hasn't really been that successful. So I think this is more a natural process that's occurring in response to these shifts in working patterns, but also maybe some sort of the psychological impact of being in lockdown and realising there's a different sort of life out in the regions.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions. I might just give people a moment if they want to think about it and pop a question in. While I'm waiting, I might ask Jennifer a question, if that's all right. Thank you for your presentation on what we've seen in the data about the deaths in the provisional, the deaths data from the Bureau of Statistics. Have you given thought to the sort of the longer term effects on not just mortality but also morbidity from COVID-19, from people who experience it, who survive it, what we might expect to see in future for them?
So particularly the insurance industry has been looking very hard at the mental health statistics, so quite concerned about mental health impacts, not so much from the COVID-19 itself, but from the economic impacts and the lockdown impacts. So haven't really seen enough evidence to suggest that that's happening, but certainly that's something that we're looking out for. You've probably heard of long COVID, which has been people are starting to talk about, and that also happened as a post-viral syndrome back in 1918. The latest statistics I've seen suggest that, you know, a very broad brush, about 1% of people who get COVID end up with a serious case of long COVID. Now, it's too early to tell because long COVID by its definition means a very long-term illness and it's not actually been long-term yet. But certainly that has happened in previous pandemics for viral infections, that significant numbers of people have been disabled by them longer term. So I think that's something that we definitely need to watch for. I did want to actually also echo Elin and thank the ABS, because this is more information that we've had about mortality much quicker than we've had for a very long time. So in the midst of a pandemic, having all that extra data has been fantastic. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that answer, Jennifer. So I'm just keeping an eye on what's happening in the chat.
Can I ask Peter a question?
Oh, yes, please do.
Peter, I'm wondering on your fertility and thinking about this delaying of couples and how COVID-19 might cause them to further delay. If a lot of this delaying is happening, I don't know, I imagine amongst the kind of more those with education, those with in the kind of more secure job market. I'm thinking these people might also be most protected, at least in the past year, by COVID-19. Is it possible that maybe there is no more, maybe they'll discontinue because especially if fertility doesn't extend beyond 40, or at least significantly, there's not a whole lot of time if they've delayed things until their 30s. So they may just proceed. Is there that type of, so it may actually not be much of a reduction, at least amongst those groups, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, I don't think the international data for all of these countries has shown that there's been quite considerable fall in fertility in the recent years among the groups with lower education, in fact. So in the Nordic countries, the US is very much that way. The US teenage fertility has dropped enormously in a short period of time. So a lot of the delay is actually occurring among people who in the past might have had their babies because they didn't have anything else to do, but because they weren't employed. But the march of education, I think, of keeping younger people in school longer is probably affecting all of those countries. That's a good trend. So a lot of this can be interpreted as quite a positive trend of people not having babies at very young ages. Nevertheless, there is evidence of decline also at the older ages, particularly in the late 20s. I think it's probably becoming time where we started to investigate why this is happening. I have a bit of a view actually, which is only a purely personal view, that we're producing a very pessimistic generation. We keep telling them that they're not going to own a house, they're not going to have a job, they're not going to have this, they're not going to have that, that the world's going to end from climate change, etc. So that, I don't think that's the right way to be going. I think we need to be encouraging younger people about their future. As an old person, I can say that.
Thank you, Peter. That was great. Thank you.
Peter, we do have one more question on fertility analysis on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, and if that's also expected to decline significantly as a result of COVID.
Well, yeah, it's a bit hard to say exactly, for a group like the Indigenous population as to whether their fertility will fall because of COVID, but the fertility of the Aboriginal population is higher than the general population, but it's not all that much higher, and it has fallen substantially. So the trend in Australia has been towards fertility rates being rather similar across different groups, rather less heterogeneous fertility.
Thank you very much for that, Peter. So we might wrap up the the session, if that's all right. We're sort of getting close to 3 o'clock. So I'd like to thank you all the participants for your sessions. Again, thank you for your time and for your views. It's been really interesting, and thank you to everybody online who joined to view this and who asked questions. This session has been recorded and it will be available from the APA channel on YouTube. And the session tomorrow, in the continuation in the APA conference series, will be how state governments use population data. So once again, thank you very much to all our presenters, and I'll call this session to a close. Thank you.